On January 15, 1929, a baby boy was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Doctors called him perfect, and his parents were overjoyed. They named him Michael, after his father. When the child turned 5, his father chose to change both of their names to Martin, and the boy became Martin Luther King Jr. Martin grew up in a warm and orderly home. He had an older sister, Willie Christine, known as Chris, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel. The King family lived on Auburn Avenue in a comfortable neighborhood of Atlanta, a place where few were very poor and few were very rich. His family life was steady and affectionate. He could not recall his parents arguing. His mother, Alberta Williams King, was calm and soft-spoken. The daughter of a respected minister, she had attended college, an uncommon achievement for black women at the time. With a generous spirit and an open ear, she was easy for her son to confide in. His father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., projected strength and confidence. He had grown up poor, in a deteriorating shack, in a family of sharecroppers who worked land they did not own and kept only a portion of the harvest. Through discipline and persistence, he earned both high school and college diplomas. After college, he became pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Martin Jr. admired him deeply. The church served as a second home. Martin sang in the choir, attended Sunday school, and learned how to relate to people of all ages. There he absorbed lessons in community, dignity, and service. As a young child, he also formed a close friendship with a white boy whose father owned a store across the street. The boys played together from the age of 3. When they turned 6, they entered separate schools, one for black children and one for white. Soon after, the boy's father forbade further play. Martin came home in tears, and the friendship ended. That evening the family spoke at length. It was Martin's first clear understanding of how many white people viewed black people. Even so, his parents counselled restraint and love. As Christians, they told him they must not hate. His mother urged him to keep a sense of somebodyness. She reminded him that he mattered, even when the world tried to deny it. As he grew older, Martin saw discrimination everywhere in the South. Whites-only signs marked hotels, restaurants, and drinking fountains. On buses, black passengers were forced to sit in the back, and arrest awaited those who challenged the rule. In movie theatres, black patrons were confined to the balcony. These were the Jim Crow laws, and they stirred his anger and resolve. In high school, Martin rode the bus each day and took his place in the rear. He once travelled to Dublin, Georgia for a speech contest where he won and felt proud. On the ride home, a driver ordered Martin and his teacher to surrender their seats to white passengers. When they did not move quickly, the driver grew angry. The law prevailed, and they stood for the entire 90 miles. Quietly, Martin made a promise. "One of these days I am going to put my body up there where my mind is." He knew that someday he would sit at the front of the bus. Experiences like these shaped his resolve. Despite the injustice he faced, Martin continued to focus on his education. He was an exceptional student from an early age. He loved books and excelled at public speaking. His dedication to learning allowed him to advance quickly, and he completed high school at the age of 15. That summer he travelled to Simsbury, Connecticut to work in the tobacco fields. It was his first experience in the North. There he observed a very different way of life. Black and white children attended the same schools. They sat together in the same restaurants. The contrast left a deep impression on him. He began to imagine a South where such equality could one day be possible. When Martin returned to Atlanta, he enrolled at Morehouse College, the same institution his father had attended. Morehouse was a historically black college, where both students and teachers were African American. At first, Martin was uncertain about his future. He wished to serve the black community, but he had not yet chosen the path. He considered law and also the ministry, following the example of his father. During his studies, Martin encountered an essay written in 1849 by Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau argued that individuals should refuse to follow laws that were unjust. To protest slavery, he had declined to pay taxes and was briefly jailed. Thoreau's willingness to suffer for principle impressed Martin. It offered a peaceful model for resistance. 2 of his professors at Morehouse were ministers whose character and wisdom deeply influenced him. Their guidance helped Martin decide to pursue the ministry. At 17, he delivered his first sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Though he was not yet ordained, his words resonated with the congregation and moved his father. The following year, Martin formally entered the ministry as an assistant pastor at Ebenezer. In 1948, at the age of 19, he graduated from Morehouse College. His father hoped he would remain at the church, but Martin wished to continue his education. He enrolled at Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. Out of 100 students there, only 6 were black. At Crozer, Martin studied the work of Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of India's non-violent struggle for independence. Gandhi taught that change could be achieved through peaceful resistance. Martin found in these teachings a philosophy that aligned with his own growing convictions. In 1951, Martin graduated from Crozer at the top of his class. Still eager to deepen his understanding, he moved to Massachusetts to attend Boston University. It was in Boston that he met Coretta Scott, a young music student. They spoke often of the challenges of being black in America and of their shared hope for a more just world. Martin admired her intelligence, strength, and compassion. Within an hour of their first conversation, he felt certain she would become his wife. In time, she did. On June 18, 1953, Martin and Coretta were married in her family's home in Marion, Alabama. Afterward, they returned to Boston, where Martin completed his doctoral studies and Coretta continued her musical training. When Martin earned his degree, he became Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He stood at the threshold of his life's work. The question that remained was where his calling would lead him. As he prepared to take his first steps into ministry, opportunities soon appeared. 2 churches, one in Massachusetts and another in New York, invited Martin to serve as their minister. As he considered those positions, a third invitation arrived. The Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama was without a pastor and asked him to come and preach. On a clear winter morning in January of 1954, Martin set out for Montgomery. During the drive, he listened to one of his favourite operas. The music, paired with quiet stretches of southern countryside, made the hours pass smoothly. As he travelled, he practised the sermon he intended to give. By the time he reached the city, he felt a sense of anticipation. It was not public speaking that concerned him. He had preached many times at his father's church. But this moment carried weight. If he delivered the sermon well, he might be asked to guide the congregation. He also wondered whether he was ready to return to the South. Life in the North had offered a measure of fairness that was still rare below the Mason-Dixon line. Yet the congregation in Montgomery seemed committed to meaningful change. Martin reminded himself of the heart of his calling. He did not need to impress anyone with eloquence. He only needed to speak with honesty, faith, and purpose. The following day, Martin stepped into the pulpit and delivered his sermon. It was thoughtful, steady, and deeply sincere. The members of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church responded with warmth and conviction. They asked him to become their pastor. Martin and Coretta discussed the offer at length. Coretta had concerns. Opportunities for black women in the South were limited. They wondered what life would be like as they built a family there. After careful thought, they reached their decision. They chose to return to the South. It was their home, and in Montgomery, Martin believed he could help guide a community toward greater dignity and equality. The move marked the beginning of the work that would soon place him at the forefront of a national movement. Soon after settling in Montgomery, Martin began his work as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church on September 3rd, 1954. From the pulpit, he urged his congregation to register to vote, reminding them that the ballot was a powerful tool for challenging unjust laws. He also encouraged membership in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded on February 12, 1909, to support equal access to jobs, education, and housing. These were core issues in the struggle for civil rights. After a year in Montgomery, Martin and Coretta welcomed their first child, a daughter named Yolanda Denise, lovingly called Yoki. Their young family felt newly grounded. Only 2 weeks later, an event occurred that would reshape the course of American history. On December 1, 1955, a 42-year-old black woman named Rosa Parks boarded a city bus in Montgomery. Instead of moving to the back, where black passengers were forced to sit, she took a seat near the front. When the driver ordered her to move, she quietly refused. She was arrested. Black community leaders, including Martin, met to consider a response. They agreed to stop riding the buses entirely. This action became known as a boycott. If black citizens withheld their ridership, the bus company would begin to lose revenue. Pressure might then force change. The boycott began on Monday, December 5th at the start of the work week. Families planned carefully. Some shared rides, some used taxis, many walked long distances. Martin believed their unity would speak louder than anger. If they could not sit with dignity, they would not ride at all. That morning, Martin and Coretta looked out their window toward the nearby bus stop. The bus arrived empty. Martin drove through the city and saw the same scene repeated. Streets filled with men, women and children walking to work and school. Some walked more than 10 miles. Their resolve was unmistakable. The first day had been successful, but persistence was necessary. The boycott had to continue until the law changed. City officials were unsettled. The bus company suffered financial losses, yet leaders refused to end segregation. They attempted to pressure the black community by raising taxi fares to make travel more difficult. In response, Martin and other leaders organised carpools. Volunteers, both black and white, offered their time and vehicles. It became a powerful demonstration of disciplined, peaceful coordination. Still, peaceful resistance carried risks. Martin was arrested under the claim of speeding, a charge he knew was unfounded. Soon after, a firebomb was thrown onto the porch of his home. Though frightened for his family, he remained committed to the cause. The boycott continued for more than a year. At last, the United States Supreme Court ruled that segregated seating on Montgomery's buses was unconstitutional. On December 21, 1956, black citizens in Montgomery were free to sit wherever they chose. That morning, 3 leaders of the boycott arrived at Martin's home. Reporters gathered, cameras clicking as they walked together to a bus stop. When the bus arrived, Martin stepped aboard and sat at the front. A calm, unmistakable smile crossed his face. A quiet revolution had taken place. The world had changed. Yet the victory in Montgomery was only a first step. The integration of Montgomery's buses had succeeded, but Martin Luther King Jr. understood that this marked the beginning of a larger struggle. Soon afterward, he and other black leaders met in Atlanta, Georgia, to form an organization dedicated to advancing civil rights through nonviolent action. It was named the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. On February 14, 1957, Martin was chosen to lead the organization. Across the South, the fight for equality grew more intense. Homes were bombed, churches were targeted, even local businesses were attacked. In response, Martin urged calm. He reminded the movement that violence could not lead them forward. Non-violence, he insisted, was the only path that could transform both law and conscience. As his message spread, so did his influence. Crowds gathered wherever he travelled. Thousands came to hear him speak. People stopped him on the street to ask for his autograph. His voice had begun to reach the nation. On May 17, 1957, Martin spoke at the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom in Washington, D.C. The event marked the 3rd anniversary of the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education, which declared school segregation unconstitutional. Before the Lincoln Memorial, black and white citizens stood together. The speakers called on Congress to pass a civil rights bill that would secure equal rights for all Americans. Martin emphasized one central demand, that every adult citizen must have the right to vote. He urged President Dwight Eisenhower to make voting rights a national priority. During this period, Coretta managed their household and supported Martin's growing responsibilities. On October 23rd, their second child, Martin Luther King III, was born. Martin later said that he owed his strength to Coretta's unwavering loyalty and sacrifice. Coretta wished to take a greater role in the movement, but Martin encouraged her to remain focused on caring for their young family. In 1959, Martin accepted an invitation to visit India, the homeland of Mahatma Gandhi, whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance had shaped his own thinking. There, Martin witnessed both deep poverty and remarkable resilience. Many slept on the streets while others lived comfortably, yet the people did not respond to hardship with bitterness. They held fast to dignity and discipline. In the coastal village of Dandi, Martin reflected on Gandhi's famous march against attacks on salt. Gandhi had begun the walk with only a few companions, but thousands joined along the way. Some say more than 1 million people eventually followed. Gandhi taught his followers not to meet violence with violence. Instead, he instructed they were to keep moving forward without striking back. The lesson left a lasting mark on Martin. When he returned to the United States, Martin was more certain than ever that nonviolent protest had the power to change societies. Later that year, the King family moved from Montgomery back to Atlanta. Martin needed more time to devote to civil rights work and could no longer serve as a full-time pastor. He continued at Ebenezer Baptist Church, now working beside his father. He told his congregation, "History has thrust something on me which I cannot turn away." By 1960, the movement was gaining strength. College students across the South staged sit-ins at lunch counters, reserved for white customers. They sat quietly and waited to be served. They endured shouting, spitting, and physical attacks. When one group was arrested, another group returned the next day. Their discipline drew attention nationwide. Martin joined the sit-ins. On October 19, 1960, he was arrested at a department store lunch counter in Atlanta along with more than 200 students. He appeared in court and declared that segregation was morally wrong. He remained in jail for 5 days until the store owners dropped the charges. Yet many local officials were determined to see him imprisoned again. On May 4, 1960, Martin was stopped by police for driving with an Alabama license while in Georgia. Expecting only a fine, he was instead taken away, shackled, and transported more than 200 miles to a state prison. He went without food, water, or information. The intent was to break his resolve. When his supporters learned of his situation, they sought help. They contacted Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy, both then running for president. At first, neither candidate intervened. Nixon declined to comment. Kennedy hesitated. At last, a friend persuaded Kennedy to act. Kennedy telephoned Coretta, who was pregnant and deeply distressed. He assured her that he and his brother, Robert Kennedy, would work to secure Martin's release. Robert called the judge who had ordered the imprisonment, and soon afterward, Martin was freed. The Kennedy campaign then circulated leaflets highlighting Nixon's refusal to respond. The contrast influenced voters. Martin's father publicly changed his support to Kennedy. Many others followed. In November 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. He became the first Roman Catholic to hold the office. Many black voters believed Kennedy would understand discrimination, having experienced prejudice himself. They hoped that through his leadership, the struggle for civil rights would move forward. In the months that followed, change came slowly. By 1961, some progress had been made in the South. Fewer lunch counters displayed the sign, "Whites Only." Yet many public spaces remained segregated. Waiting rooms, restrooms, and restaurants in bus and train stations still forced separation by race. Although the courts had ruled such practices illegal, many communities simply ignored the law. Martin Luther King Jr. raised these concerns with President John F. Kennedy, but the administration did not act swiftly. On May 4, 1961, a group of students set out from Washington, D.C., aboard 2 buses bound for the Deep South. At rest stops along the route, black members of the group deliberately sat in areas reserved for white patrons, quietly challenging segregation. Their goal was to demonstrate that change could be pursued through peaceful resistance. In Anniston, Alabama, the riders faced brutal violence. One bus had its tires shot out, the other was firebombed. As passengers escaped the smoke and flames, they were attacked by a waiting mob. The journey was forced to end, yet the movement did not break. More young people joined the effort, continuing to ride buses southward. Many were attacked, arrested, and jailed. These courageous individuals came to be known as the Freedom Riders. One evening, a group of Freedom Riders gathered inside a church in Montgomery, Alabama. Martin came to speak to them. Outside, an angry crowd hurled stones and bottles surrounding the building. Inside, Martin urged calm and endurance. The congregation joined together in singing "We Shall Overcome," their voices steady and unshaken. Eventually, the crowd outside dispersed, but the struggle continued. In Albany, Georgia, the bus station resisted all efforts to end its whites-only policy. There, a physician named Dr. W. G. Anderson organized what became known as the Albany Movement. Sit-ins and boycotts were staged throughout the city. For months, Martin led marches and demonstrations in support of the effort. Once again, he was arrested. He intended to serve his 45-day sentence. Yet after only a few days, he was unexpectedly released. It seemed that neither intimidation nor imprisonment could hold him. He had been turned away from buses, from stores, and now from jail itself. Despite the sacrifices made in Albany, segregation laws there did not immediately change. Some might have seen this as a defeat. Martin did not. He viewed the experience as part of a longer journey, one that required persistence, discipline, and patience. The movement would continue. The struggle for freedom was far from over. With that understanding, Martin prepared for the next challenge. he remained resolute in demonstrating the strength of non-violent protest. He chose to confront one of the most deeply segregated cities in the nation, Birmingham, Alabama. If conditions in Albany, Georgia had been difficult, Birmingham presented an even greater test. In Birmingham, public life was sharply divided by race. Schools remained segregated. Water fountains were marked coloured or white. The city's police commissioner, Bull Connor, enforced the Jim Crow system with intimidation and force. His authority created fear not only among black residents, but also among white citizens who opposed segregation but were frightened to voice dissent. Martin and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference developed a plan. Along with sit-ins at lunch counters, they organised meetings in black churches throughout the city. These gatherings strengthened resolve and reminded participants of the principles of nonviolence. Protesters sang freedom songs, including We Shall Overcome, which carried a message of unity and endurance. Martin believed these songs helped build courage. The first phase of the campaign began with sit-ins. Within 3 days, 35 demonstrators had been arrested. Then came the second phase. Martin and other leaders called for a boycott of white-owned businesses. Nearly half of Birmingham's residents were black. Without their patronage, businesses faced serious financial pressure. On April 6th, Martin organised a march to Birmingham City Hall. Many joined him. Bull Connor responded with force. Police officers struck protesters with clubs and released dogs on them, yet the demonstrators remained steady. Their resolve grew stronger. Within 10 days, approximately 500 people had been arrested. Some were released on bail, but many remained in jail. Up to this point, Martin had stayed out of the marches to continue providing leadership. If he were arrested, he would be unable to guide the movement. On April 12th, he met with fellow leaders in his hotel room. His father and brother were present. Some urged caution. Others insisted the time had come for him to march. Martin stepped away to reflect in silence. When he returned, he wore the simple clothing he used when he expected arrest. His decision was made. He would march. As anticipated, he was arrested. Under ordinary circumstances, he could contact Coretta, but this time he was denied the opportunity. Coretta, having recently given birth to their fourth child, feared for his safety. Martin was placed in solitary confinement, a small cell with only a narrow window for light. There, he reflected on the struggle beyond the walls around him. Outside the jail, 8 white clergymen published a letter criticising the protests. They argued that the demonstrations were unlawful and incited division. In response, Martin wrote a long and thoughtful letter, composing it in the margins of newspapers and on scraps of paper. He explained that just laws deserved respect, but unjust laws must be challenged through peaceful means, and those who challenge them must be willing to accept the consequences. This message later became known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail. After 8 days, Martin was released. Soon after, one of his advisers proposed involving children in the marches. At first, Martin hesitated. The risks were significant, but others believed the police would not harm children. Thousands of young people, from young grade school students to teenagers, received training in nonviolent protest. They marched, and many were arrested. On May 2nd, a large demonstration began. At one school, the principal locked the gates to prevent students from leaving. The students climbed the fences and joined the march. Their determination reflected the wider movement. Bull Connor responded with even greater force. Fire hoses blasted young demonstrators to the ground. Police dogs lunged at them. Homes were firebombed, including that of Martin's brother. Explosions were heard across the city. But the nation was watching. Television cameras captured the scenes in detail. Americans saw the violence unfold in their living rooms. Public opinion began to shift. White business leaders in Birmingham, alarmed not only by the unrest but by the economic impact of the boycott, met to negotiate. They agreed to desegregate public facilities, improve job opportunities for black workers, release jailed protesters, and establish a biracial committee to guide further progress. In Birmingham, the Jim Crow system had begun to fall. Martin had led the movement to one of its most significant victories. The impact of that victory reached far beyond the city itself. Birmingham demonstrated to black Americans across the nation that peaceful protest could bring real and measurable change. From North Carolina to Tennessee to Oklahoma, people marched, held sit-ins, and gathered before government buildings to demand fair treatment. Gradually, lunch counters, hotels, schools, and public parks began to open their doors to all citizens, regardless of race. On June 11, 1963, President John F. Kennedy addressed the country and asked Congress to pass a civil rights bill. He stated that every American should have the right to be served in public facilities such as hotels, restaurants, theaters, and stores. To him, this was not a special request. It was, he said, a basic right. That summer, civil rights leaders organized a march on Washington, D.C. They wanted Congress to see and hear the large number of Americans who supported the bill. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people traveled to the nation's capital. Many came by bus or car, others arrived by plane, some walked long distances, and a few even came on roller skates. Most of the marchers were black, but many white supporters stood beside them. Together, they moved toward the Lincoln Memorial, singing as they went. Throughout the day, several leaders spoke, yet it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech that left the deepest impression. He had prepared written remarks, but as he faced the crowd, he set the text aside. He remembered a speech he had delivered earlier that year, one built around the words, "I have a dream." He spoke of a future in which the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners would sit together in peace. He spoke of a world where his own 4 children would be judged not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. He ended with a note of hope, saying that when freedom finally arrived, all people would join in the spiritual declaration, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The march and the speech were broadcast on television. For many Americans, it was the first time they had heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak. The effect was profound. His voice reached living rooms across the country and inspired millions. From that day on, he was recognized as the leading voice of the civil rights movement. However, only 2 weeks later, tragedy struck. On September 15, 1963, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. 4 young girls lost their lives, 11-year-old Denise McNair and 14-year-olds Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Addie Mae Collins. The nation grieved. Martin himself was overcome with sorrow. He contacted President Kennedy and travelled to Birmingham to help calm the city and prevent further violence. The federal government sent 25 FBI agents and bomb specialists to investigate. Then, on November 22, 1963, tragedy struck again. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He became the 4th American president to be killed while in office. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. 5 days later, he addressed Congress, urging them to pass the Civil Rights Bill in Kennedy's honor. Congress agreed. On July 2, 1964, nearly a century after the abolition of slavery, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. Standing beside him was Martin Luther King Jr., whose leadership and unwavering commitment had helped make that moment possible. Later that same year, the world recognized the depth of his contribution. Martin had demonstrated to the world that change could be achieved through words rather than violence. In 1964, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, an honor given to those who make significant contributions to peace and human progress. Martin accepted the award with gratitude, but he made it clear that it belonged not to him alone. He dedicated it to the thousands who had marched, endured jail cells, faced threats, and held fast to nonviolence. He donated the full prize money of $54,000 to civil rights organizations. Yet even with this recognition, Martin understood that his work was far from done. True equality had not yet been achieved. He reflected on the setbacks in Albany and the triumphs in Birmingham, and he knew there were still communities where justice had not reached. His focus turned towards Selma, Alabama. In Selma, nearly half of the population was black, but only about 1% of them were registered to vote. The barriers were severe. The registration office was open only a few days each month. The literacy tests given to prospective voters were so difficult that Martin once remarked that even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court might not be able to answer them. For weeks, Martin led groups of black citizens to the courthouse to register. Marches were considered illegal in Selma, and many participants were arrested. Thousands were jailed for simply seeking the right to vote. On February 1, 1965, Martin himself was arrested. While he was in jail, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee invited Malcolm X to Selma. Malcolm X believed that physical resistance was justified and spoke passionately about black pride and identity. Martin, however, maintained his belief in nonviolence. From his cell, he wrote a letter published in the New York Times stating, There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls. Tensions rose across Alabama. One night, a young protester named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot during a demonstration. He was 26. Before he died, he told witnesses that he had been shot by a state trooper. His death weighed heavily on the movement. In response, Martin called for a march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, to demand voting rights. But the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, banned the march. Still, on March 7, 1965, 650 marchers set out. Martin remained in Atlanta that morning to preach, planning to join them later. The marchers walked peacefully. Then state troopers advanced, armed with nightsticks and tear gas. Riders on horseback charged into the crowd. 70 people were injured. The violence was filmed and broadcast across the nation. Americans watched in disbelief. Protests erupted in cities across the country. Martin was devastated when he heard what had happened. He also felt deep remorse for not being present. He immediately organized a second march. On March 9th, Martin led 1,500 people toward Montgomery. Before they began, he told the group that anyone who did not feel completely committed to nonviolence should step aside. When they reached the bridge leading out of Selma, they found state troopers blocking the road. Martin understood that pressing forward would lead to bloodshed. He made the difficult decision to turn back. Soon afterward, President Lyndon B. Johnson intervened. He announced that the protesters had the legal right to march and promised federal protection. On March 21st, the march began again, this time with support from across the country. Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Black Americans and white Americans walked together. They travelled through valleys, over hills and along highways. Their bodies ached, but their determination held strong. When they reached Montgomery, their numbers had grown to 25,000. At the state capitol, they presented a petition calling for voting rights for black citizens. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. He declared that every American must have an equal right to vote, and he acknowledged the painful truth that many had been denied this right solely because they were black. The act ended literacy tests and placed federal officials in charge of voter registration. The marchers from Selma had achieved a profound victory. The right to vote had been secured. Yet securing legal rights did not immediately change the conditions of daily life. Even with the right to vote, and with the legal right to sit at any bus seat or dine in any restaurant, daily life for many black Americans remained extremely difficult. Jobs were scarce. Wages were often too low to support a family. Many lived in aging buildings with failing heat and leaking pipes. Illness was common, and medical care was often out of reach. Frustration grew. Some felt that change was not coming quickly enough. After the death of Malcolm X in 1965, groups formed to continue his message of forceful resistance. The Black Panther Party was among them, promoting black pride and self-defense. These voices drew the attention of many who felt that nonviolence had not yet delivered the progress they needed. In August 1965, tension erupted in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. Crowds filled the streets, fueled by years of hardship and anger. Windows shattered, fires spread, property was taken and buildings burned. The violence lasted 6 days. Many were injured or killed. The United States Army was eventually called in to restore order. Martin understood the cause of the unrest. He explained that when people feel unheard, they will react. He compared riots to the outcry of a neglected child who has reached the limits of silence. One rioter told him, "We know a riot is not the answer, but we have been suffering for a long time and nobody cared. Now at least they know we are here. A riot may not be the way, but it is a way." Martin recognized that the root of this anger was poverty, so he began to focus on economic justice. He believed that equality required not only legal rights, but also the ability to earn a stable living. On July 26, 1965, he led a march to Chicago City Hall. Chicago was the second largest city in the nation, and home to more than 1 million black Americans. Many lived in crowded neighborhoods where poverty was widespread. Although laws forbade housing discrimination, many landlords refused to rent to black families. In 1966, Martin moved his own family to Chicago. They left their comfortable home and rented a small rundown 4-room apartment for $90 a month. In comparison, a larger apartment in a white neighborhood cost less. In time, Martin saw his young children become restless and upset. He realised that they had no safe place to play. There were no parks nearby. He began to understand the daily strain of living with so few resources. That summer, Martin led numerous marches throughout the city. These demonstrations were peaceful, but the response was not. Bricks, bottles, and insults were thrown, yet the marchers did not strike back. Martin presented a list of demands to Mayor Richard J. Daley at City Hall. The demands called for an end to police violence and an end to discrimination in housing and employment. The mayor offered no meaningful response, so the marches continued. A young minister named Jesse Jackson, a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, proposed marching through the white neighbourhood of Cicero, where 70,000 residents lived. City officials and police believed such a march would provoke open violence. Mayor Daley urged Martin to cancel it, promising that the city would address the issues raised. Martin and the SCLC trusted this promise and agreed to postpone the march. But the promised changes did not come. Conditions in Chicago remained largely the same. Martin began to consider where the movement would go next. The fight for equality was entering a new and uncertain chapter. As the struggle continued without sufficient local support, Martin realized that the movement needed to reach beyond individual cities. When it became clear that some city governments would not support meaningful reform, he turned his attention to the federal level. He and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference planned a national march on Washington, D.C. for the spring of 1968. The goal was to urge Congress to pass legislation that would create better opportunities and fair employment for poor Americans of all backgrounds. Before the march could take place, Martin travelled to Memphis, Tennessee. There, the city's sanitation workers were on strike, demanding fair pay and safer working conditions. Martin believed their struggle reflected the broader fight for dignity and justice, so he went to stand with them. On March 28, 1968, he led a peaceful march through the streets of Memphis, but the demonstration did not go as planned. A group of teenagers broke away from the march, shattered store windows and looted businesses. Violence erupted. It was a direct contradiction of the non-violent discipline Martin had taught for years. Martin returned to Atlanta after the unrest, yet he felt compelled to continue supporting the workers in Memphis. Despite threats against his life, he returned on April 3rd. He remained committed to those who had placed their hope in him. The next day, Martin met with local leaders to discuss the strike and the upcoming march on Washington. That evening, he stepped onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. The air was cool and still. Then, without warning, a gunshot cut through the quiet. Martin collapsed. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead. The civil rights movement had lost its most powerful voice, and the nation was left in shock and mourning. In the weeks that followed, the search for his killer came to an end. On June 8, 1968, a man named James Earl Ray was arrested for the assassination. Ray had a long criminal record involving robberies and repeated prison terms. After his arrest, he confessed and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Later, he denied responsibility, but he was never able to provide evidence to support his claim. James Earl Ray died in prison in 1998. Even so, Martin's legacy did not fade with his passing. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered as one of the foremost leaders of the civil rights movement. His commitment to justice, equality, and human dignity continues to be honoured around the world. After his death, his wife, Coretta Scott King, carried forward his work. She travelled widely, speaking on behalf of peace and human rights. She became a leading voice in the international effort to end apartheid in South Africa. Coretta remained a steadfast advocate for civil rights until her passing in 2006. Martin's children also worked to preserve and extend their father's vision. In 1997, Martin Luther King III was elected to lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization his father once guided. He served in that role until 2004. Martin's youngest daughter, Bernice, entered the ministry and continues to speak publicly on matters of social justice and nonviolence. His youngest son, Dexter, attended Morehouse College and, in 1997, visited James Earl Ray in prison. After their conversation, Dexter came to believe that Ray was not responsible for his father's assassination. Martin and Coretta's eldest child, Yolanda, known to many as Yoki, became an actress, author, and advocate for peace. She appeared in several films, including a miniseries based on her father's life titled King. Yolanda passed away on May 16, 2007 at the age of 51. In 1980, Martin's childhood home on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, along with several surrounding sites, was designated a National Historic Site. Visitors may walk through the neighborhood, explore the museum, and learn about the movement that reshaped the nation. 3 years later, in 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation establishing a national holiday in Martin's honor. It is observed each year on the third Monday in January near the date of his birth. In his final sermon on April 3, 1968, Martin spoke of how he hoped to be remembered. He wished to be known as a man who tried to serve, who sought to feed the hungry, and who loved others. Today he is honored for these qualities and more. The dream he shared did not end with his life. It continues to guide and inspire the world.